It was October 24th, 1907, between 1:30 and 1:40 in the afternoon. 14 New York bank presidents put $25 million in cash on the loan post of the New York Stock Exchange. The exchange was about to suspend trading for the first time since 1873. The cost of overnight money on the floor had gone from 9.5% to 100% in 2 trading days. At moments that morning, there had been no offers at any rate. This is the panic of 1907, the last major American financial crisis without a central bank. By the time it ended, the United States had decided it needed one. In 1906, the Dow Jones Industrial Average peaked at 103. From there, it entered a slow, grinding bear that lasted 22 months and took 48.5% off the index. By the autumn of 1907, the market had been declining longer than most traders on the floor had been working. The pressure came from 2 directions. The April 1906 San Francisco earthquake destroyed roughly 80% of the city. London insurers paid out hundreds of millions in claims, and the gold left England for New York. The Bank of England raised its discount rate aggressively through 1906 and 1907 to pull the gold back. That tightening reached the New York call money market through the summer of 1907. The fragility was structural. By 1907, New York's trust companies held about the same total deposits as national banks. They were not members of the New York Clearing House. Their reserve requirements were a fraction of what national banks carried. They were the era's shadow banks, aggressive on yield, thin on liquidity, and outside any mutual rescue mechanism. There was no Federal Reserve. There was no FDIC. When stress hit the trust companies, there was no automatic backstop. There was J.P. Morgan, Cortelyou's Treasury, and whatever could be assembled by hand in the next 48 hours. On October 14th, 1907, F. Augustus Heinze, and his brother Otto, in partnership with the New York financier Charles W. Morse, attempted to corner the stock of the United Copper Company on the New York curb. By the close, on October 16th, the corner had failed. Heinze and Morse were ruined. The corner itself was small. What mattered was the network. Heinze and Morse sat on the boards of multiple trust companies. On October 18th, the New York papers ran the link between Charles Morse and Charles Barney, president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company, the 3rd largest trust in the city. The board pressured Barney to resign on the 21st. The same day, the National Bank of Commerce stopped clearing checks for Knickerbocker. The New York Clearing House refused to step in. Trust companies were not members. On the morning of October 22, 1907, lines formed outside Knickerbocker before the doors opened. In 3 hours, the trust paid out $8 million in cash through the teller windows. At 12:30 p.m., Knickerbocker suspended operations. By the end of the day, the daily call money rate had gone from 9.5% to 70%. Morgan had sent his men to examine Knickerbocker's books that morning. They could not, in the time available, certify the trust was solvent. Morgan let it go. The next institution down the line was the Trust Company of America. By Wednesday morning, the run was at its doors. Quick pause. This episode is sponsored by a private community I run, a private archive where I break down 100,000-plus deep dive analyses, economics, historical patterns, and capital markets. The full 1907 reading list lives in there. If the architecture of this panic caught you, there's a deeper archive on banking crisis patterns inside. far past what fits in a 14-minute episode. Link is in the description below. Now, back to the Cascade. By Wednesday, October 23rd, the run had jumped to the Trust Company of America, the second largest trust in New York. The Federal Reserve History essay calls what happened that day the heaviest bank run in American history up to that point. Morgan put two of his men inside Trust Company of America's books overnight, Henry Davison, who would later co-found Bankers Trust, and Benjamin Strong, 34 years old, working for Bankers Trust at the time, who would 7 years later become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. By the afternoon of October 23rd, Strong reported back. Trust Company of America was solvent. Morgan turned to the assembled bankers and said, "This is the place to stop this trouble." He committed his own balance sheet, then secured matching capital from Stillman of National City Bank, Baker of First National, and Rockefeller, who pledged $10 million by wire that day. Thursday, October 24th, was the worst day on the exchange floor. By midday, the daily call money rate had hit 100%. At moments, brokers could not borrow against stock collateral at any rate. Forced liquidation was imminent. At 1:30 p.m., the president of the New York Stock Exchange, Ransom Thomas, walked the short distance from the floor to Morgan's office and asked if Morgan was going to let the exchange close. Morgan summoned 14 New York bank presidents. They subscribed $25 million in 10 minutes. Runners carried bundled cash across Wall Street that afternoon and put it on the loan post. Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou matched the private sector pool from Washington. The annual report of the Secretary of the Treasury for fiscal year 1907 records that banks' liabilities to the federal government rose from $57 million on August 9th to $98 million by October 31st, about a $40 million increase across the panic weeks. Cortelyou's October 24th deposit alone moved roughly $25 million directly into New York City clearinghouse banks. The exchange did not close. For the first time since 1873, Wall Street had come within 90 minutes of forced suspension and pulled back without one. The acute phase of the panic compressed into one long weekend at Morgan's Library on East 36th Street. About 120 bank and trust company officers were summoned. The remaining trust companies, chiefly Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust, needed roughly $25 million more to survive the next week's runs. The bankers balked at Morgan's subscription plan. He locked the library doors and pocketed the key. They stayed inside until early Monday morning, when they signed for the $25 million Trust Company rescue pool. In parallel that weekend, Morgan engineered the purchase of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company by U.S. Sliders Steel. The deal moved a block of toxic collateral off the books of the brokerage Moore and Schley. It required an antitrust waiver. Henry Clay Frick and Elbert Gary briefed President Theodore Roosevelt at the White House on Sunday morning. Roosevelt granted the waiver before markets opened Monday. The Dow bottomed at 53 on November 15th, 11 trading days after the library was unlocked. NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, dates the resulting recession from May 1907 to June 1908. Industrial production fell about 16% over the year that followed. Real GNP fell about 11%. Friedman and Hilt's 2012 work documents that aggregate deposits at New York City trust companies fell 36% between August 22nd and December 19th, 1907. National banks lost about 10% over the same window. The trust companies bore the brunt because they were outside the clearinghouse safety net, the same structural fact that made them the run's first target. There is a pattern. In September 1873, the railroad bond underwriter J. Cook and Company declared bankruptcy. 2 days later, the New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 consecutive trading days, the first time in its history. The depression that followed ran 65 months, the longest in American records. In February 1893, the Philadelphia and the Reading Railroad declared bankruptcy. By year-end, 503 banks had failed. Treasury gold reserves fell from 190 million in 1890 to 100 million in early 1893. The Treasury defended the gold standard by issuing $50 million in bonds. The pattern repeats: failure of an institution outside the safety net, cascade through the most exposed counterparties, call money market collapse, Treasury or private rescue assembled by hand, multi-year recession. In September 2008, the same structural cascade ran one more time when Lehman Brothers filed bankruptcy and AIG required emergency federal support. The structure rhymed exactly. The institutional response did not. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, which authorized emergency currency and established the National Monetary Commission to study the panic and recommend reform. The commission, 18 members chaired by Senator Nelson Aldrich, published 23 volumes of research over the next 4 years, including the direct primary record of 1907, Sprague, Sprague's History of Crises, under the national banking system. In November 1910, a small group of bankers and senators, Aldrich, Treasury Assistant Secretary Andrew, Henry Davison of Morgan, Frank Vanderlip of National City, Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb, and Benjamin Strong met secretly at the Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia and drafted what became the Aldrich Plan. Carter Glass and Senator Robert Owen revised it. President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23, 1913. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York opened for business on November 16, 1914. Its first governor was Benjamin Strong, the man who had audited Trust Company of America's books overnight in Morgan's library on October 23, 1907. 25 million in 10 minutes was what kept Wall Street open in 1907. In 2008, the same structural problem, a non-bank institution failing outside the clearinghouse safety net, was answered with $700 billion in 3 days. The numbers grew. The structure did not. Markets have memory. Most of it is forgotten on purpose. The panic of 1907 took 22 days to run, 18 months of legislative work, and one architecturally specific institution, the Federal Reserve, to make sure the next cascade did not need a private library to stop it. Every market crash has a pattern. Here it is.